turn on, tune in, and drop out.
Psychedelic icon Timothy Leary's plea to the counterculture in 1967 was to turn on, tune in, drop out. Wake up to the reality of life under a system that is perpetuating devastation and injustice, and then refuse to participate. Remove yourself from the restrictive conformism of consumerist culture and live on your own terms, where we can cultivate love and peace, no longer living in service to a world of domination and exploitation. Unrealistic as the dream underlying the call to drop out of society was, it really captured the desires of the hippie movement and radicals searching for an alternative. Psychedelics were celebrated in these communities for their perceived liberatory capacities, to free us from our own limited imaginations that fail to see beyond the inevitability of capitalist society as the only possible system of social organization. This defiance and inspiration for the creation of new worlds that psychedelics were engendering could not be tolerated by society's elites. Psychedelics were outlawed as part of the wider war on drugs, which gave the state increased powers when it came to policing minorities and left-wing radicals, and subdued any hope of chemically induced resistance. After half a century of a psychedelic winter, we find ourselves in a very different psychedelic context today.
I haven't drank since my very first session.
To depression.
I haven't felt sadness.
Psychedelics will soon be used as medicine in Australia, with the TGA approving MDMA and psilocybin.
Psychedelic revolution going on in the world of mental health treatment. After decades of legal restriction, drugs like psilocybin and LSD are being studied as treatments for depression, addiction, and eating disorders.
According to a market research report, the psychedelic therapy market was valued at $3.6 billion in 2021. That figure is expected to more than double by 2028 as interest from the medical community and investors grow.
All of a sudden, widespread establishment enthusiasm for these compounds that were previously vigorously suppressed and demonized. Longtime psychedelic advocates celebrate their newfound acceptance by their historical enemy. But I would argue there is serious reason for skepticism over this blossoming union between psychedelics and finance capital.
My name is Christian. I used to be a heretic because I believe that psychedelics can have a place in medicine to treat various mental health disorders.
Billionaire Christian Angermayer is the guy of corporate psychedelia. He is a major player in the two largest companies in this space, Atai Life Sciences and Compass Pathways. He is the founder of Atai, and Atai is the largest shareholder in Compass, owning around 30% of the company. Angermayer then is the most influential actor bringing psychedelics from regulatory grey zone to the free market. He has some pretty eccentric views on the possible uses for psychedelics. He says of taking psilocybin that it was the most important experience of his life, and afterwards he finally understood Bitcoin, which is sort of like an anti-realization. It's like waking up to the profound truth of the Church of Scientology or something. He's also contributed 2/3 of the funding for a project that aims to reconcile the Israel-Palestine conflict through a process of psychedelic mediation. If dropping out of society seemed unrealistic, solving one of the most complex geopolitical issues with an ayahuasca retreat seems outright delusional. Angermayer and his companies also receive investment from the Antichrist, Peter Thiel. They receive money from Peter Thiel. It's cliche at this point to make Thiel the venture capitalist bogeyman of any leftist critique, but to be fair, he plays the role really well. A follower of the philosophy of Ayn Rand, Thiel lives by the ethos that self-interest is the ultimate mode of human existence. As a consequence, his investment behavior and business enterprises are usually geared towards strengthening the state's monopoly on the use of force to have greater capacity to defend his own financial interests. In a speech given to a right-wing think tank, Thiel said, "I no longer believe democracy and freedom to be compatible." It's relevant to understand his investment in psychedelics, as well as his personal friendship with Angermayer. It's relevant because, if you have optimism for the utility of psychedelics to bring positive change into people's lives and/or wider society, then maybe we should be a little skeptical of the intentions of the players behind the moves in this industry. Thiel is an ideological investor. He does not invest in things for the good of humanity. No one does, but Thiel especially is the poster boy of cynical, self-interested, fuck you investing, all for the purpose of realizing a world of autocratic rule, where the elites are no longer restricted by the demands of democracy. His dreams are very different from the counterculture of Timothy Leary and his psychedelic acolytes. And so, what do we know of the ideological drives behind Christian Angermayer? Well, he sits on the board of the Hayek Institute, which should be a pretty dead giveaway. If you don't know anything about Friedrich Hayek, he was a part of the Austrian school tradition of economics. His writing was very influential in the development of neoliberal economic theory, which again, like Ayn Rand, suggests that human beings are innately self-interested. If we harness this power of self-interest in a market, this will somehow lead to a balanced state of affairs. It is integral to neoliberal economic thinking that the market should be the mediator that encompasses all aspects of human cooperation. Hayek's view of humanity as a collection of self-interested individuals rose to prominence in the 80s, with Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK. Thatcher famously stated there's no such thing as society, only individual men and women. The economic consequences of this shift from the previous model of Keynesian New Deal economics, that focused more on using the wealth capitalist society generated to build up public services and social well-being, was now that it was up to individuals to generate their own financial well-being.
What are people?
Like,
They are economic units, but together form a market.
So high income and corporate tax was slashed, organised labour was disempowered, public utilities were privatised to diminish the role of government and allow the more efficient market to control everything. Any remaining public services like unemployment, pensions, schools, healthcare operate on reduced funding and are increasingly administered by private organisations and run according to competitive market dynamics. The rationality here is that individuals shouldn't rely on society to provide for them. They must earn their own survival in the market. The great irony of this, as Mark Fisher wrote in Exiting the Vampire Castle, is that the ruling class propagates ideologies of individualism while tending to act as a class. They tell us we're all individuals, but then they stick together to have their economic interests implemented. The thing is though, Angermeyer does seem to have an understanding that the everyday person or working class are in serious crisis right now.
The working class has a real issue because their job's gonna vanish, all of them, 100%. Sort of the whole world is kind of going into, or is already in, a mental health crisis, meaning it's really in a mental health crisis in terms of really like what we at the moment define as mental health crisis, like depression, anxiety, addiction. So all of opioid addiction, like all of these numbers are skyrocketing. Mm-hmm. But I think we have way more issues we as a sort of planet or humanity is going through mentally, which we have not defined yet as a real disease. Somehow I think the majority of people feels that the world is going in a direction which A, doesn't make sense for them, so they can't understand a lot of things anymore, and B, they subconsciously, and that's even worse, know there might be no place for them in the world, let's say, we the tech elite is building.
I do love the audacity to refer to yourself as we the tech elite. Like, yeah. Me and the boys, me and my fellow tech bros, we own all the technological means of production. So ultimately, it will be us determining what kind of future you live in.
And so my vision is, and I'm super excited about it, that in 10 years, 15 years, all of us going to have brain implants. Yeah, brain computer.
Transhumanism is a whole other worrying trend in this neoliberal tech billionaire space. Probably even more worrying than their focus on psychedelics, but we'll cover that another day. So he was talking about how broad disenchantment and pessimism over the future is generating widespread discontent and mental health crises like depression and anxiety. This is where his involvement with psychedelics comes in.
So I think like we all have this collective mental health issue. Again, for a disease we don't have a name for yet. It could be like, I don't have one, like it's not a good short name, but like being afraid of the future or don't feeling at home in the world anymore. A lot of people feel disconnected from everything, from the world, from people, whatever. And psychedelics bring back that enormous sort of love for the creation, if I want to say. And I think what we all have to go into this time with the same mental health is like this awe, like this sort of, the future's gonna be fine, like we just need to find a way.
This is the crux of his interest in bringing psychedelics into an establishment medical framework. His view is the world economy is going in a direction that benefits him and his fellow tech elites, but that leaves a majority of people economically disenfranchised, with the rise of insecure work and less accessible public services. This state of affairs also cultivates a sense amongst people that they are being left out, They don't feel connected to a wider community, and it's this dual loss of social connection and economic opportunity that then gives rise to the crises of mental health, with people depressed about their present and anxious about their future. His remedy for this situation is not to argue for a structural realignment of society, to free people from a life dominated by market rationality. His solution is basically just vibes. Give the people a feeling that everything is okay. Everything that we're building for your future, brain implants and whatever, it's all good. We the tech elite, we've got this. You just sit back and enjoy the illusion of meaning being implanted into you. It's like he's literally read Brave New World and thought, yeah, I like this. This is how we should do things. It's not about fixing things. It's about making us all okay with things being broken.
This is fine.
This is now the complete opposite of Leary's turn on, tune in, drop out. Instead, we have turn off, tune out, drop in. Ignore and forget all the problems you see around you, the injustices, the inequalities, the lack of connection to a wider community. Come to us, the well-meaning tech elite, with your depression, your anxiety, your addictions, all the mental suffering induced from the toil of living under neoliberal capitalism, and we'll get you back to feeling 100% ready to enthusiastically consent to your own domination once more. And look, I know it's not as simple as a one-to-one relationship between depression and capitalism. These mental illnesses manifest with an interplay between biopsychological as well as socio-economic forces. Depression and anxiety will likely always be around as inherent consequences of the human experience, but for them to be at crisis level, it's because something in our society isn't going right. There's a real biopsychological determinism embedded in mental health discourse, which Mark Fisher wrote about, and counters with the actually pretty common sense notion that if people don't feel they belong in society, and don't feel they have access to opportunities to create meaning in their lives, of course there's going to be increases in depression and addictions that numb the numbness. Fisher writes, "Mental illness has been depoliticized, so that we blithely accept the situation in which depression is now the malady most treated by the NHS. The neoliberal policies implemented first by Thatcher governments in the 1980s and continued by New Labour have resulted in the privatisation of stress. Under neoliberal governance, workers have seen their wages stagnate and their working conditions and job security become more precarious. But the medicalisation of depression is part of the problem." To bring this back to Christian Angermayer, to be fair to him, he doesn't totally fall into this depoliticization framework. As we saw him explain earlier, he sees the problem as a loss of meaning and connection in our societies. He does have a social analysis of mental health issues, but he does also gatekeep it in this medical framework, where he still wants to administer a medically induced cure for these conditions, rather than structural changes and redistribution of resources that would greatly reduce the strain on the mental health of everyday people, but undermine his position as a member of the tech elite.
Point that I think psychedelics should be taken in a medical context, or at least with a guide. So I had a very good shaman doing it with me. By the way, and I have to say it more often, like, a trip must not be nice. It's not a party trip. It's nothing you want to do in a disco. Yeah. So
he is adamant psychedelics are not for recreational purposes. If we common folk were permitted access to these profound experiences on our own terms, outside the purview of a watchful clinician who will guide us into the light of knowing that life is good and the future is bright, who knows what we might start to think? What conclusions we might draw from seeing our world through a different realm of perception ordinarily inaccessible to us? Then some really dangerous ideas could start to flourish amongst the masses, who don't like the world that we the tech elite are building. An area of particular interest for psychedelic clinical intervention is in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, especially for members of the armed forces traumatized by the realities of deployment. Right-wing hedge fund manager Robert Mercer donated $1 million to the MAPS Foundation for research in this area. Use of MDMA to treat PTSD has been shown to be incredibly effective in trials and has just been approved for use in Australia. It's absolutely a positive development to increase access to these types of treatments for those who need them. But the business elite like Thiel, Mercer and Angermayer likely have far more cynical motivations here. The power of Western capital is not maintained with peace and love. It's shock and awe. It requires a certain level of psychological blowback to carry out your imperial interests and maintain your position atop the economic hierarchy. Even when engaging in violence from thousands of miles away, drone operators still suffer severe psychological distress from the destruction they inflict. The burnout from warfare makes armed service members less able to continue the fight for foreign domination, less able to reintegrate back into society, and potentially very disenchanted with the mythology of standing up for freedom that sent them there in the first place.
Pat Tillman loved the game of football. Yet he loved America even more.
If capital had some way of freeing the pawns it sends into battle from the horrors they were exposed to, perhaps they won't be as resentful. They'll be able to readjust to civilian life. Their shelf life as commodities you purchase to keep control of foreign resources is extended. If you think this sounds aggressively cynical, check out this interview with Rick Doblin, the head of the MAPS Foundation.
One of the best aspects, at least publicly, of what you guys are doing is that you are working with all these soldiers. Yeah. And so you've got a lot of support from people that traditionally wouldn't be invested in psychedelics, which has really kind of opened up. It used to be that a lot of people on the right thought of psychedelics as a way to waste your life and you're going to be a hippie and a loser. But because of the benefits that it's been showing to people with PTSD and people coming back from, you know, all these various foreign conflicts, then you're getting support from veterans. You're getting support from the people on the right and people that know veterans that have had incredible experiences with psychedelics where it's completely changed their life and sort of reset their mind.
Yeah, just several days ago I was in Nashville with Sean Ryan doing his podcast, and he is a former Navy SEAL and CIA contractor, and he was just talking about how much he had benefited from his experience with Ibogaine in Mexico and how it's changed his views about things. And we've heard this a lot, but he still said that if he were to be attacked, if America was to be attacked, he would defend it. It doesn't turn people, again, into pacifists necessarily in that same way.
Doblin makes clear psychedelics are not supposed to turn people into the stereotypical anti-war hippies that the right loathe. They're just simply meant to help you overcome the trauma that's been inflicted upon you so that you can go right back to defending American economic interests. Let's be real, this interview is PR. Joe Rogan has the largest audience of any podcast, and Rogan in the first 5 minutes, which is realistically the best time to make a pitch, where you can guarantee the maximum number of viewers rather than buried in there somewhere 2.5 hours deep. Right away, Rogan's like, so, you're using psychedelics to cure PTSD? Say more. The aim of this is for it to be seen by finance capital as part of a campaign to let them know psychedelics are not the enemy. In fact, if you have an interest in a psychologically robust military force to defend your economic interests, you could make a donation towards that goal. There is precedent for psychedelics as potential tools of combat with the MKUltra experiments in the 1950s. Before psychedelics were adopted by the counterculture, they were used by the CIA in their quest to develop a higher breed of soldier, one free from emotional shackles who could kill unremorsefully and be psychologically incapable of defying orders.
The CIA set up a secret project called MKUltra. It was led by a psychiatrist called Ewan Cameron. He took patients and, without telling them, experimented to see if he could wipe what he called the sick memories from their minds. To do this, he used repeated electroshocks and massive doses of LSD.
After years of drugging mostly homeless, poor people, veterans, many without their consent, they discovered this wasn't really possible and just said, oh well, and moved on, leaving their subjects with their sense of self obliterated into a million pieces.
They shipped me up to what they call the sleep room, and they gave me all of these electroconvulsive shock treatments and megadoses of drugs and LSD and all of that, and I have no memory of any of that. Nothing of that time of the Allen Memorial or any of my life previous to that, all gone, wiped.
While today their use would be more as aftercare for the unavoidable side effects of combat, I don't think it's crazy to suggest this would still be a fulfillment of the MKUltra legacy, to use psychedelics to increase soldiers' mental capacity for conflict. And you might be thinking, okay, so Peter Thiel is a demonic vampire, and Western billionaires do have an interest in their soldiers being as robust to the demands of conflict as possible. But what's the alternative? Isn't it a good thing for veterans with PTSD and depression to be given access to treatments that will help them recover and live some semblance of a normal life? And yeah, that's true. This isn't an argument about not allowing access to these treatments, but what the alternative is is maybe not going to war in the first place. And I know how that sounds to most people who think the world is an inherently violent place and will always need military force to prevent our own subordination. And to an extent there's truth to that. World War II, we can all kind of agree, I think, was a necessary use of military force. But World War I, the various conflicts in Southeast Asia, the rise of drone warfare, and the various occupations in the Middle East. All of these wars are conflicts over resources, regional influence, and subverting foreign populations to elite Western interests of capitalist accumulation. These were not necessary. So maybe we could ease up on the foreign interference, and this would have the added positive consequence of lower numbers of people afflicted with PTSD as a result of being cannon fodder for imperial interests. Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, draws a connection between the MKUltra experiments and the neoliberal economics that Christian Angermayer, as a Hayek Board Institute member, is a representative of. MKUltra worked on the idea that perhaps you could use psychedelics to break down all the conditioned behavior in a person's psychological makeup, reducing them to blank slates with no memories or beliefs that made them unique human personalities. Then you project onto this blank slate whatever beliefs and behaviors you desired that could cultivate obedience to authority.
Dr. Cameron pursued a concept he called depatterning, which was meant to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state wherein doctors could take advantage of the person's cognitive vulnerability to attempt to rebuild their mind under the doctor's control.
Unfortunately, though, for the CIA, it didn't quite work that way. They did find success in reducing people to blank slates, void of any memory or connection to who they previously were, but uploading new memories was not successfully achieved. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, according to Klein, follows the same pattern of intent, to break down a given society's social mythology or memories about how production and resources should be controlled and distributed, and then in the immediate vacuum building up a new social reality to dominate our shared understanding of how society should be organized. And the neoliberal experiment has been incredibly successful at achieving these aims. We've all seemingly forgotten there was once a world where the top marginal tax rate was 90%.
Just 2 days ago, there was a billionaire in here, what's his name, Michael Dell. And he asked the question like, name me one country where a top marginal tax rate of 70% has actually worked. And, you know, I'm a historian. The United States, that's where it has actually worked. In the 1950s, during Republican President Eisenhower, you know, the war veteran, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91% for people like Michael Dell. You know, the top estate tax for people like Michael Dell was more than 70%. I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean,
now the myth of society has been broken down and replaced with the myth of the individual, where it is up to you and you alone to prove your worth and justify your own survival. If you find yourself in undesirable circumstances like poverty or run-of-the-mill financial insecurity, that's because it's what you deserve. The market is the rational, impartial arbiter of truth. It does not lie.
I always say that the market doesn't lie.
In The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Timothy Leary lays out a guide for navigating the disorienting reality of a psychedelic trip. In it, he and his co-authors delineate the concepts of set and setting, which are extremely important considerations before embarking into the psychedelic unknown. Set, or mindset, refers to the user's general mental state, and the importance of keeping your mind flexible and open to a new experience where you don't have a great degree of control. Setting is the space or environment you'll be inhabiting while you experience the trip. A setting that feels safe and comfortable with minimal external stresses is important. The notion of set and setting is typically concerned with the individual and the interacting relationship between their mindset and their setting. But if we were to broaden this out from the individual to the social, we can think of setting not just as the immediate space you inhabit like a park or your house, we can think of it as the society that you exist in. So in a sense, your setting is neoliberal capitalism. And your set or mindset on a social level is the interactions between various ideas and social forces in your society's milieu that is conditioned upon you beliefs that form your own ideological persuasion. Set and setting, when broadened out like this, start to parallel a concept within Marxist theory, base and superstructure. Base refers to the production forces, or the materials and resources that generate the goods society needs. That's your physical stuff or setting. Society's superstructure includes the culture, ideology, norms, and identities that people inhabit. In addition, it refers to the social institutions, political structure, and the state or society's governing apparatus. Marx argued that the superstructure grows out of the base and reflects the ruling class interests. As such, the superstructure justifies how the base operates and defends the power of the elite. So your mindset, is an individual reflection of society's superstructure. And just as the superstructure, being the culture and ideology in your society, largely justifies the status quo, for instance that a small fraction of the population should own everything, and you are an individual responsible for your own survival, your own mindset is very likely composed of these ideas that you've absorbed over a lifetime immersed in this reality. So as you, the individual, try to be mindful of your set and setting for your trip, what you're probably neglecting is that your mindset is composed of society's cultural and ideological norms which reflect ruling class interests. Psychedelics can have the effect of reinforcing your pre-existing ideology, or in the right setting, forcing you to question and confront it. If you are a patient in a clinical setting receiving clinician-administered psychedelic therapy, you are in a relationship to the forces of production as a consumer of a commodity produced by a capitalist corporation. In this setting, your position in this relationship and your psychological distress are depoliticized, siloed off from the broader context of base and superstructure. And your ideological predisposition, shaped by elite interests, that your mental health is purely a phenomenon of your own individual psychobiology and not broader societal structures, will remain unchallenged. This is why there is a need for Angermeyer to be the gatekeeper of psychedelic settings, so they will only be used to deal with the trauma afflicted by societal structures, while directing you away from viewing this trauma as connected to societal structures, and from asking the question, could we not alter these societal structures that lead to mental health problems in the first place? And remember, Angermeyer does view the current mental health crisis as a function of the state of the world. He just wants to treat it with a medical intervention that will help you overlook the current state of the world. Mark Fisher notes what was unique about the counterculture's adoption of psychedelics was the democratization of these substances. The psychedelic was not new. Many pre-capitalist societies had incorporated psychedelic visions and the use of hallucinogens into their ritual practice. What was new was the breakout of the psychedelic from particular ritualized spaces and times, and from the control of particular practitioners, such as shamans and sorcerers. Getting to experience these altered states of consciousness without the supervision of a guardian of the status quo allowed for the liberatory capacities of psychedelics to flourish, and allowed for people to see outside of the superstructure that dominates our ideological assumptions about the world. It's not that psychedelics imbue inherently radical or subversive ideas. The experience they generate is greatly dependent on the cultural setting you find yourself in. Michel Foucault, for instance, a darling of left-wing critical theory, didn't try LSD until 1975, after a majority of his contemporaries in radical, artistic, or academic spaces had long grown bored of it. By the mid-70s, optimism for radical change was waning, economic crisis was looming, and the brave new world of neoliberalism was emerging over the horizon. In this cultural context, Foucault drops acid, describing it as Angermeyer did, one of the most important experiences of his life, and his thinking then shifted from a more radical leftist perspective to one of neoliberal enthusiasm. Countercultural acolytes of the previous decade of the 60s that associate LSD with nonconformity, rejection of societal expectations, and the dream of a better world did not necessarily get these ideas as a direct result of taking psychedelics, but in a cultural context of disenchantment with their society, where the status quo is already being challenged, psychedelics can act as a catalyst to allow people the freedom to deeply confront their own ideas, which are reflections of the status quo. This is cause for concern for the billionaires of psychedelic production. Long after we've come down from the highs of cocaine-fueled neoliberal economic boom of the 80s, and the triumphant declaration of the end of history with the fall of communism in the 90s, we now find ourselves in a situation of pervasive discontent. Wealth inequality has rapidly expanded. Racial divisions are at boiling point.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
The climate crisis hasn't spurred a response from our ruling elites anywhere near adequate enough to demonstrate they care about us more than profit. Perhaps if there were a revival in psychedelic consciousness like we saw in the 60s, it's possible we'd be emboldened in our demands, as well as emboldened in our belief, in our own ability to reshape the world in our own image of mass solidarity. We the people could be the ones doing the breaking down and building up of our own social mythology, rather than the billionaire tech elite, who in our world could become obsolete. Acid communism is the provocative term Mark Fisher gave to what would have been a project outlining his desire for a renewal of the 60s psychedelic countercultural belief in the possibility to create just such a world of mass solidarity and class consciousness, and escape his diagnosis of the real illness of our time, capitalist realism, or the inability to imagine an alternative to capitalism ever being possible. He begins though with a quote from Marxist theorist Herbert Marcuse with the line, "The spectre of a world which could be free." Marcuse's writing was extremely popular among student radicals in the 60s. The spectre he alludes to here is an idea that haunted the legitimacy of the establishment's methods of control. The scarcity that had existed in previous modes of economic production was now replaced with overproduction. It was becoming clear that the material abundance necessary to provide a high standard of living to all was not that far away, and we should no longer require perpetual toil through alienated labor that dictates the majority of our waking lives. And yet, things continued unchanged. But this spectral idea that we could be free bred anxiety in the elite. A situation like this, where worker interest in alternatives to capitalism was growing, had been seen decades earlier after the Wall Street crash of 1928 and the Great Depression stirred popular animosity towards the capitalist system. The contemporary successes of the Russian Revolution were looking very attractive to a large subset of the Western working class. In this moment, US President FDR and British economist John Keynes were aware of the precarity of the establishment. According to Keynes's biographer Robert Skidelsky, Keynes's message was simple. The remedy for economic depression was government intervention and spending to stabilize demand. Without these measures, he warned, there would be a social revolution, just as there had been in Russia. FDR and Keynes sought to stave off any revolutionary impulse with a grand compromise, the New Deal. This New Deal thinking that became the hegemonic economic model throughout the West, from post-World War II until neoliberalism's emergence in the 80s, sought to use the power of the state to more equitably distribute wealth amongst the population and strengthen the power of organized labor, but maintained capitalist ownership of the means of production. The increase in financial stability and material conditions as a result of the New Deal satisfied the working class, and radicalism decreased. Revolution was successfully avoided. But as the decades went by, a growing sense started to emerge amongst younger generations that they were still ultimately captive to the demands of the capitalist system. John Keynes had predicted, with technological innovation and as organized production became more efficient, the needs for work would decrease. And by the turn of the century, we could see a 15-hour work week, as we would just decide not to work as much. There is a hilariously out-of-touch NPR interview about why it might be he was so wrong about the 15-hour work week materializing.
John Maynard Keynes' argument for the 15-hour work week was that over time, thanks to machines and technology and new ideas, people get more productive. An hour of labor produces more and more stuff. Keynes figured we'd just decide to work less. Richard Freeman, a Harvard economist, says one of the things Keynes underestimated was the human desire to compete.
You think about these basketball players who get $80 million, $100 million contracts. You might have said they'll just take one contract. That's enough money to live your entire life in wealth and just never work a day.
Or just play like 1 year. Just play a couple of years, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But they don't, and they push themselves, and they push themselves. Keynes would have had great trouble understanding
LeBron
them.
James. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's all well and good. But most of us don't get to work in environments like the NBA, where our deepest passions for lived experience motivate us to total dedication to the job. Most of us work at fucking Tesco's, or 7-Eleven, or Kmart, or a call center, or an airport cafe, or drive Ubers. Most of us are highly alienated from the products of our labor. When you've never had to take a job you hated to pay the bills, and have always had your work be a rewarding passion project, you might come to the conclusion, well, we love our jobs and we work long hours. The workers in meatpacking facilities forced to wear diapers on the job to meet their productivity requirements, they must love standing in their own shit 50 hours a week. What they are totally missing is this wasn't meant to be a maximum 15 hours of labor. It was that any labor over and above 15 hours wouldn't be required. The freedom you're granted from lower work hours is time to pursue whatever it is in life that you're passionate about. If your passions happen to align with your occupation, then fucking fantastic. Work as long as you want. That's bonus productivity. No one's gonna stop you. We don't not have a 15-hour work week because people just love folding and refolding high street fashion sweatshop produced t-shirts. Man, these retail workers are competitive. We don't have it because of class warfare, where the ruling class dictate the need for workers to generate profits for them for as long as they can possibly get away with. We take for granted the idea that we have a 5-day work week, 8 hours a day, as though this is some natural division of time time bestowed on us by the employment gods. According to the Australian Workers' Union, in the 1800s, most Australians worked 14 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. In 1856, in Melbourne, construction workers went on strike, demanding an 8-hour workday, which they won. Union campaigning eventually led to a 44-hour workweek in 1939 and a 40-hour workweek in 1947. And yet the economy did not disintegrate, with people now allowed some basic standard of leisure time, despite the protestations of conservative ruling elites, who fought the unions and opposed the strikes every step of the way, under the pretext that this would harm the economy. If those gains had not been won by organised labour throughout the Western world, a 14-hour workday with no weekend would still be the norm. And it's been almost 80 years since those last concessions were won. We're long overdue further reductions in the work week. Keynes and NPR's Illiteracy on Class explains the failure of the 15-hour workweek to materialise. As Keynes said, he believed this would come about as a function of our own decision-making as a society to choose to work less. He rightly understood this wouldn't come about naturally, like we'd all just wake up one day and find the employment gods have blessed us with a 3-day, 5-hour roster. It requires human agency to make this change. What Keynes failed to grasp is, we do not have the power to make this change. A ruling class who control the modes of production and distribution actively work to prevent such a change. This is what the younger generations in the 60s who identified with Marcuse's Spectre saw. They saw, regardless of the fact they had a better deal than their grandparents, that this deal didn't represent a direction of travel towards liberation from servitude as Keynes had suggested, even though they were living in a world where this should be possible. Marcuse's Spectre of a world which could be free is a clear reference to Marx and Engels' opening to the Communist Manifesto. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. Mark Fisher names the Marcusian spectre of the countercultural era the spectre of acid communism. Acid communism points to something that at one point seemed inevitable, but which now appears impossible. The convergence of class consciousness, socialist feminist consciousness raising, and psychedelic consciousness. The fusion of new social movements with a communist project. This optimism for just such a new future was mirrored in the early 70s socialist project of Salvador Allende. Allende was experimenting with a form of democratic socialism which offered a real alternative both to capitalism and to Stalinism. The American-backed coup and military destruction of the Allende regime and the subsequent mass imprisonments and torture are only the most violent and dramatic example of the lengths capitalism had to go to in order to make itself appear to be the only realistic mode of organizing society. It wasn't only that a new form of socialism was terminated in Chile, the country also became a lab in which measures which would be rolled out in other hubs of neoliberalism, financial deregulation, the opening up of the economy to foreign capital, privatization, were trialed. Under the US-supported military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, American economists advised the new regime on the implementation of neoliberal economics, synonymous with the likes of Friedrich Hayek. After this neoliberal experiment in Chile in the 70s, Western elites and governments took up the mantle of neoliberalism in the 80s. Fisher's contention is that in the neoliberal era which began with the overthrow of Allende, this spectre of a world which could be free, the spectre of acid communism was exorcised from mass consciousness, with passive resignation to the current state of affairs and no dreams of a better world that could take us beyond the horizon of capitalism. FDR and Keynes had staved off revolution through compromise, where the architects of neoliberalism staved it off through the crushing of dreams. However, Fisher saw the material conditions for a psychedelic revolution are more in place in the 21st century than they were at the height of the counterculture. The outbursts of widespread discontent in recent years that have to a large extent laid the blame at the feet of the capitalist system provides a glimmer of hope for radical consciousness to bring people together in the shared dream for a new world. The French protests that began as a response to the raising of the retirement age and privatization of the pension scheme have provided flashes of people opening up to the possibility that maybe there is something more than this. It's not just the pensions anymore. It's a broader awareness of a status quo governed by elite interests and a desire to reorganize the world to serve the needs of all of us. In this context, resisting the allure of acid capitalism that seeks to submerge us in the false consciousness of accepting a society being run at odds with our collective interests is vital. Stop seeing every psychedelic mainstream media piece uncritically as an inherently good thing that these substances are being accepted. Ask, why is it they are being accepted? What are the benefits to finance capital and imperial interests in their promotion of societal acceptance of these substances? Establishing discourse on the undeniable link between our present conditions of alienation under neoliberal capitalism, of excessive work demands and financial precarity, with the mental health crisis. as well as the need to hold on to the belief of acid communism. The belief that there is a post-capitalist society for us to reach, and that maybe the consciousness-shifting power of psychedelics can embolden us in the struggle for the creation of a new world, one where the tech elite are no longer the directors of progress.
Controversy, buddy.